Hey guys, tonight we take a step back, beyond the realm of modern romance and right into the dustier, much quieter streets of medieval life. We're entering a world where sex wasn't quite the free-for-all it can sometimes feel like today. In the medieval world, sexual norms were deeply entwined with religious doctrines, social expectations, and even the law. The concept of sexuality itself was more than a personal experience. It was a reflection of your entire standing in society. The rules governing sex were strict, especially for those trying to live upright lives in a religious society. It was expected to be reserved for marriage, and even within that institution, it was framed in a very particular way. Medieval people, especially the church, didn't just care about your actions. They were concerned with your thoughts and even your dreams. Yes, you heard that right. Your very thoughts about sex could lead to a sin, and that could have serious consequences. The intensity of medieval sexual codes can be a bit overwhelming. But let's break it down slowly. Now, imagine walking down a narrow, cobblestone alley as the faint glow of lanterns flickers in the background, casting long shadows. You pass a small group of townsfolk gathered outside a tavern, perhaps discussing something as mundane as the weather. But beneath the surface, everything is governed by these unspoken, highly structured rules around sex, marriage, and even basic courtship. It's a little different from the modern world, you know, where relationships are often formed in less rigid ways. Back then, relationships and sexuality were a whole different ballgame. And you were expected to follow these rules carefully. Historians still argue whether these medieval rules about sex were rooted more in practicality, making sure the family and society functioned, or if it was all about religious doctrine controlling every aspect of life. Some suggest that marriage in the Middle Ages was often about survival and producing heirs, while others think it was more about controlling people's desires. In any case, when it came to sex, everything was carefully managed and regulated, just like how medieval peasants plowed their fields with meticulous care, driven by the cycles of the seasons and the needs of the community. As you continue to wander down this ancient alleyway, the murmur of voices fades, replaced by the occasional clink of iron from blacksmiths hammering away in the distance. You pass by the homes of peasants, where life is tough, and relationships are bound by necessity as much as love. In this world, the idea of sex, especially outside of marriage, was considered a serious transgression. But how serious? You ask, well, it wasn't just a case of breaking a rule. In medieval times, sexual misconduct could affect the entire community. Even a minor slip-up could result in public shaming, punishment, and a potentially disastrous blow to one's reputation. So, before we get too deep into the details of medieval relationships, let's take a moment to appreciate something that might seem strange to us today. The medieval concept of virginity. It wasn't about purity in the modern sense, but more about social status. Virginity, especially for women, was a symbol of value and the key to a good marriage. A woman's worth was often determined by her ability to remain untouched until the wedding night. This concept of virginity wasn't merely personal. It was a reflection of family honor. For men, virginity wasn't quite as emphasized, but their reputation was still bound by their sexual conduct, though often in different ways. Historians still argue whether these notions of virginity were entirely about sexual control or if they were tied more to property and inheritance. Some say that medieval society valued virginity in women because it ensured that a man's children were indeed his own and could inherit his wealth. Others suggest that these rules were purely religious, meant to impose order and purity on what was seen as an otherwise chaotic world of carnal temptation. The first time a couple came together for sexual activity, especially after marriage, was often ceremonial. Picture this. It wasn't a private matter, unlike today's more discreet unions. There was, in fact, a good amount of public attention paid to this first encounter. The marriage bed, after all, was seen as sacred, and the act of consummation held deep social and religious significance. In some parts of medieval Europe, a community might actually wait outside the newlyweds' room to hear the proof of the marriage's consummation. If the husband and wife didn't follow through with the expected performance, they risked public disgrace, and their marriage could be annulled. It was as much a performance as it was an act of union. But of course, we're not just talking about first marriages here. Medieval sexual customs varied dramatically depending on the class, region, and, of course, religion. For peasants, sex was a necessity to produce heirs, whereas for the noble class, it often had more to do with the perpetuation of power and wealth. In the courts of kings and queens, marriage was as much a political tool as it was a personal bond. The royals didn't just marry for love, they married for alliances, for land, for power. And in the world of royal marriages, the idea of sexual fidelity was somewhat more fluid. However, if a noble woman's virginity was important, her sexual behavior was tightly monitored, as any scandal could lead to political consequences. Historians still argue whether the nobility had more lenient attitudes towards adultery because of the importance of strategic alliances, or whether it was simply a reflection of their power and the freedom it gave them from traditional societal expectations. It seems the nobility could afford to be a little freer with their sexual lives, given their wealth and status. Yet, even they had to deal with the shame and scandal that came with such affairs, especially if they involved betrayal of political or marital alliances. In this way, sex wasn't just about desire, it was about power, status, and politics. The more you walk, the more you realize that medieval attitudes towards sex weren't just dictated by religion and social norms. They were also deeply intertwined with survival. In the harsh conditions of medieval life, where plagues, wars, and famine often loomed large, reproduction was vital to the continuation of families, villages, and kingdoms. In this world, sex had an essential role in maintaining not only the population, but also the strength of society itself. For much of the medieval period, marriage and sex were about ensuring the future, both biologically and politically. As you continue your stroll through the bustling streets of this medieval town, you can almost feel the weight of the social contract that governed sexual relationships. In this era, marriage wasn't primarily about love, it was about necessity. It was a binding contract that brought together families, secured alliances, and ensured the inheritance of land and titles. For women, marriage was seen as the culmination of their value, and their primary role was to produce heirs. If a woman was unable to bear children, particularly male heirs, the marriage could be at risk. Divorce was difficult, if not impossible, in most cases. So childlessness was a serious issue that could bring about much social and personal turmoil. But the world you're walking through isn't just about sterile obligations. There's another, darker side to this medieval sexuality. While sex within marriage was largely for procreation, extramarital affairs were not uncommon. For noblemen, and occasionally women, these affairs were often conducted with a bit more secrecy and discretion than they might have been for peasants. In fact, men in the higher classes had more freedom to take lovers, especially since it was expected that their wives would not object too much. But if the affair involved a lower-class woman, or an indiscretion that was deemed scandalous, you could expect that the courts would quickly become involved. In the case of peasants, sexual relationships outside of marriage weren't as regulated, but the consequences were still harsh. While it might not have had the same political ramifications, a woman who had a child out of wedlock was subject to public shame, and the child might be stigmatized as illegitimate. On the flip side, men who fathered children out of wedlock often faced no significant repercussions unless the affair caused a disruption in the social order or, worse yet, affected the inheritance of land or property. Historians still debate the cultural consequences of these illicit relationships. Was the medieval world more tolerant of extramarital affairs, especially among the noble classes? Or was it a society that placed so much importance on family and inheritance that any deviation from the norm was seen as a threat? Some scholars argue that sexual infidelity among the higher classes was tolerated because it didn't threaten the core political structure, while others claim that it was closely guarded to maintain social cohesion. As you continue your journey, you come across a tavern where the sounds of laughter and merrymaking spill into the street. In this setting, one of the more fascinating elements of medieval sexuality comes into focus: prostitution. In a world where marriage was essentially a social contract, where sexual relationships outside marriage were often deemed criminal or immoral, prostitution became a necessary part of medieval society. But it wasn't viewed quite the same way we think of it today. For the most part, sex work was seen as a necessary evil, a safety valve for those who couldn't or didn't wish to marry. It wasn't always the subject of outright condemnation. In some cases, it was a well-accepted and sometimes even required profession. In urban centers, brothels were fairly common, although they were often hidden away in the back streets. The women who worked in these establishments were usually from the lower classes, and they often had little choice in the matter. But many women turned to this profession out of necessity, especially in areas where men outnumbered women. Medieval prostitution didn't carry the same stigma it does today in the context of modern society. It was seen more as an economic activity, a form of survival in a world where wealth and status were reserved for a select few. Historians still argue whether medieval prostitution was primarily about economic necessity, or whether it was tied to more complex cultural or religious beliefs. Some suggest that in the absence of formal institutions like marriage, sexual outlets were tolerated as long as they didn't disrupt the social order. Others argue that prostitution was often used to reinforce the power dynamics of the medieval world, with the highest classes profiting from the lowest. One thing is for certain: the medieval world's approach to sex was complicated, nuanced, and deeply connected to survival. As you wander deeper into the heart of the medieval city, the contrast between the structured, often harsh, societal expectations and the raw, unrestrained aspects of human desire becomes more pronounced. Medieval society, with its rigid laws and often contradictory cultural norms, had a peculiar relationship with sex. For instance, while sex within marriage was regarded as a means of fulfilling duties to family, land, and community, the moral and social pressures that surrounded it were anything but relaxed. The church, the most powerful institution of the time, had a commanding influence over sexual behavior, often condemning anything that deviated from the prescribed norms. The Church taught that sex should only occur within marriage and for the sole purpose of procreation. Anything beyond that was sinful, especially adultery, which was seen as an affront not only to the spouse, but to God. You can almost imagine the fervor with which preachers would deliver their sermons, invoking the fear of divine retribution for those who strayed from the path of righteousness. The Church's teachings on sex were a significant part of the medieval moral fabric. To stray from these rules was to risk not just earthly consequences, but eternal damnation. Yet, as you move through the town, you see the people's actions don't entirely match their professed beliefs. In contrast to the Church's influence, there was a much more primal, human side to sex, one that operated outside the realms of formal doctrine. You see glimpses of this in the back alleyways, at the edges of the bustling market square, where merchants and common folk alike engage in less than sacred practices. These weren't always illicit, but they certainly weren't endorsed by the clergy. People would often find ways to flout the system, slipping into taverns or hidden corners where the sexual mores of the time could be temporarily set aside. Even within the constraints of medieval society, desire found ways to emerge and, at times, thrive. Some scholars suggest that medieval sexuality was not purely about reproduction, but also about exploring power dynamics. The concept of the dominant and the submissive existed in various forms, whether between husband and wife, between the aristocracy and the peasantry, or even between people of different faiths. It's believed that these unspoken roles added another layer to the complex social fabric of medieval sex. These dynamics played out in the shadows, where the strict rules of marriage were less rigidly enforced. You can almost feel the tension between the public facade of decency and the private indulgence of the senses. Historians still debate the exact nature of sexual roles in medieval marriages. Was sexual submission truly a part of the expected dynamics between husband and wife? Or was it more of a modern interpretation? Some argue that medieval marriages were more about survival, economic transactions, and social alliances, where affection and sexual pleasure weren't prioritized. Others suggest that deep emotional and physical bonds were indeed possible, even in the context of a socially structured marriage, but that they were often secondary to the greater social contract. In the towns and villages, people also indulged in practices that modern society might call scandalous, but which in the medieval period were relatively common. Fertility rituals, for example, were believed to ensure a bountiful harvest or the birth of healthy children. These rites were often accompanied by pagan customs that, though suppressed by the Church, survived through folklore and rural traditions. You can picture these rituals being carried out under the full moon, surrounded by the primal rhythms of music, dancing, and chants. Though the Church condemned such acts as heresy, many still secretly turned to these rituals for their perceived power to influence life and death, fertility and prosperity. Scholars still debate how widespread these fertility rituals were. Some believe they were simply localized traditions that were practiced by rural populations who felt the need to preserve pre-Christian customs. Others argue that these rituals were more ingrained in the social fabric than we realize, influencing even some of the most powerful members of medieval society, who, despite their public piety, still secretly clung to older beliefs. The idea of sex as an agricultural act, not just for procreation, but as a symbolic act tied to fertility, is something that permeates many cultures. You can imagine the reverence with which people viewed the earth and its cycles, how intimately they connected their sexual lives with the rhythms of nature. And in this context, Sex was both a personal and communal act, one that held the power to shape the world around them. As you continue your stroll through the medieval landscape, the air feels thick with unspoken desires and the ever-present tension between religious teachings and human nature. The streets are crowded with people going about their daily lives, vendors shouting their wares, children running barefoot, and lovers exchanging glances under the watchful eye of the church. Despite the constant vigilance of religious authorities, there remains a sense of spontaneity in the air, a feeling that desires cannot always be suppressed. The taverns, the gathering places of the common folk, buzz with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of ale mugs. Here, the strict moral codes of the church are temporarily forgotten. You can almost feel the heat of the fire inside, the warmth of shared bodies and laughter, and the flickering shadows cast by candlelight. These public spaces, where social norms are relaxed and pleasures are pursued, were both the lifeblood of medieval society and a source of its tension. It was in these taverns and inns that the sexual norms of the time often collided with the desires of the heart. Prostitutes and sex workers, though vilified by the church, were an integral part of medieval life. Whether they were courtesans at the courts of kings or common women offering their services on the cobblestone streets, their presence was undeniable. Prostitutes were often seen as a necessary evil, catering to the needs of men who were expected to control their sexual desires but frequently found it impossible. Many such women lived in the shadows, their names rarely spoken, but their services frequently sought. The roles they played in medieval sexuality were complex. Some were seen as symbols of sin, while others were portrayed as the essential providers of an outlet for otherwise unfulfilled desires. Medieval sex, it seems, was always tied to notions of morality, class, and social order. For men, sex was a right that was often bound up with their status in society. But for women, it was a duty that was often imposed upon them. However, this didn't mean that women were simply passive in the matter of sex. Far from it. Women, especially in urban areas, often engaged in their own forms of sexual expression, seeking pleasure outside the confines of marriage. Many found ways to reclaim power in an environment that sought to suppress them. Some would enter into affairs, use charms, or even practice contraception in secret, all in an attempt to have some control over their own bodies. The existence of medieval birth control is often overlooked, but it was indeed part of the hidden history of sexuality in the Middle Ages. Various methods were used to prevent pregnancy, ranging from herbal concoctions to physical barriers. Some women carried small pouches filled with herbs or placed certain plants under their pillows to ward off unwanted pregnancies. The church vehemently condemned these practices, as they interfered with God's will. However, as you walk through the streets, you get the sense that women, in particular, were finding creative ways to navigate a system that sought to control them. The tension between the sacred and the profane, between duty and desire, played out in these private and public spaces, creating an undercurrent of subversive energy that ran through medieval society. Historians still argue whether these methods of contraception were widespread or simply urban legends. Some suggest that women in rural areas were less likely to use such methods, relying instead on natural rhythms and beliefs in fate. Others argue that women everywhere, especially in the burgeoning cities, were more knowledgeable about herbal remedies and contraceptive methods than history would suggest. Regardless, this hidden history paints a picture of medieval sexuality as more complex and layered than it is often portrayed. Sexuality in the medieval world wasn't simply about reproduction. It was also about power and control, pleasure and release. The church's teachings were pervasive, but they didn't entirely quash human instincts. People still sought out their desires, found ways to experiment, and created lives and stories for themselves within the constraints of society. The very secrecy surrounding sexual practices in the Middle Ages only served to increase the allure and mystique of these acts, as they existed in the shadows, hidden behind closed doors and in whispered conversations. You continue to walk along the streets, passing the worn stone buildings where people went about their daily work, knowing that the lives of men and women in this world were shaped by more than just the rules of marriage. These individuals were navigating a complex dance of desire, control, and rebellion, each with their own version of what sexuality meant in a world defined by religious dogma. And, as you reflect on this hidden history, you begin to understand the unspoken truth that even in a time so governed by faith, there was room for desire to grow and take root in unexpected places. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the medieval city streets. You can almost hear the sounds of distant church bells tolling, marking the time of evening prayers. As you wander through this world, you notice the evening rituals beginning, mothers tending to their children, servants lighting the fires in the hearths, and merchants packing up their stalls. The day's work is drawing to a close, but for many, the night is just beginning. The streets, which were bustling with activity only a few hours ago, are now more subdued, but the undercurrent of anticipation for the night's pleasures is palpable. As night settles in, the public spaces become quieter, but the private ones stir to life. In the cozy, dimly lit homes, people begin to gather around fires. Candles flicker, casting a soft glow on the wooden beams of humble cottages. Within these private spaces, people prepare for what has long been a part of the rhythm of medieval life: the bedchamber. It was here that the realities of medieval sexuality would unfold, often in ways that both adhered to and defied the expectations of the time. You can almost feel the warmth of the fire as the rooms fill with the sounds of soft voices, the rustle of fabrics, and the heavy silence of unspoken desire. Marriage in the medieval world turned, at its core, a social contract, a partnership meant to ensure the survival and stability of the family. Yet, despite the strict moral and religious framework imposed by the church, sexual pleasure was a part of it, even if rarely acknowledged openly. The act of marriage itself was viewed as sacred. But the idea that sex could be a joyful, mutual experience was a far-off notion. For women, marriage was often a duty, a necessary role in continuing the family line. But, despite this, many women found ways to reclaim a sense of agency in their sexual lives, especially within the safety of their own homes, where society's watchful eyes couldn't easily pry. As you think about it, the medieval concept of marriage wasn't just about joining two people for the sake of procreation. It was also a place where sexual exploration, however limited, took place. Couples, especially in the privacy of their bedchambers, could explore their desires, express intimacy, and form bonds that went beyond the mere transactional nature of marriage. Despite the often oppressive attitudes toward female pleasure, there were always those who found joy in the intimacy of the act, whether it was through physical pleasure or emotional connection. There's something quietly revolutionary about the way these marriages operated, especially for women. You begin to realize that the very private act of sex could, in some ways, be an expression of personal rebellion. Even in a time when a woman's sexuality was tightly controlled by both the church and societal norms, many found ways to assert their desires. One might think of the discreet ways couples navigated their lives behind closed doors, without the prying eyes of the clergy, and in places far removed from the rigid expectations of public life. As you walk deeper into this world, you can feel the importance of these private spaces, where freedom could be found in the moments between lovers, in the whispered words, in the shared breath of the bedchamber. At the same time, there were tensions within marriage that were impossible to ignore. The church had a profound influence on how sex was viewed within the confines of a marriage. Sex was, in theory, only for procreation, and anything outside of that, pleasure, enjoyment, or any deviation from this strict purpose, was forbidden. Yet, like in many societies throughout history, the disconnect between the ideal and the reality of human desire created spaces for subversion. Spaces where the private pleasures of sexual expression could not be fully controlled by religious or societal expectations. In this quiet world, where desires both public and private swirled around each person like the evening mist, it is difficult not to wonder how many of the secrets of the night were kept hidden beneath layers of silence and shadows. For many medieval couples, marriage was a complex, even contradictory, experience, a place where duty, desire, and secrecy existed side by side, intertwined in ways that history has often overlooked. Historians still debate how the medieval understanding of marriage and sexuality shaped the relationships of the time. Was the medieval marriage a pure reflection of the religious and social values imposed on the people? Or were there moments of genuine intimacy and pleasure that slipped through the cracks of tradition? Some suggest that while marriage was a public institution, the private moments between couples might have been far more complex, nuanced, and enjoyable than the rigid expectations would have us believe. Others argue that marriage, like so much of medieval life, was bound by the oppressive structures of power, duty, and faith, leaving little room for true sexual fulfillment. Whatever the truth may be, as you continue your journey through this world, you can't help but notice the growing power of the night, of those moments when the world quiets down, and the desires of the heart can take the place of the obligations of the day. This tension between duty and desire, pleasure and restriction, is an essential part of the medieval experience. And, in the quiet moments when the firelight flickers low, it's easy to imagine the intimate exchanges that took place in secret, away from the eyes of the world, where love, lust, and devotion intermingled in ways that history has only begun to reveal. The night continues to unfold as you settle into the warmth of this medieval world. Now, in the cool silence of the evening, you can almost hear the faint crackle of wood in the fire, the low murmur of voices in distant chambers. You find yourself walking through the narrow cobblestone streets of a medieval town, where the buildings lean in on each other as if whispering their secrets. The air is thick with the smell of burning wood and fresh bread, a comforting combination that wraps around you like a blanket. It's a world of simplicity, yet one filled with complexity. Here, in the quiet of the town square, the true social fabric of medieval life is coming into focus. As you stroll deeper into this world, you can't help but be drawn to the grander homes at the edge of the town. Homes that house the nobility, the ones who shape the way people live. You might think that these places are filled with nothing but wealth. But as you enter through a wooden door, the scene shifts. Inside, you find a world not just of luxury, but of power, duty, and regulation. Here, the noble class lives, and they live according to very different rules than the common folk. For them, marriage is not simply a bond of love or passion. It is an alliance of power, politics, and land. The nobles understand the value of their marriages, not just as intimate relationships, but as strategic tools used to form alliances, control resources, and, importantly, ensure the future of their bloodlines. The marriages of the medieval elite were transactional. They were not merely about the joining of two individuals for love or companionship, but about securing political power. The women in these unions were often seen as pawns, their marriages arranged in the pursuit of power, influence, or wealth. These alliances could span entire kingdoms, and the stakes were high. For the women involved, marriage was often more about duty and survival than romance. However, there was still a certain amount of room for affection, especially within the confines of the private chambers, where personal relationships could occasionally blossom. In this world, marriages were more than just about physical union. They were a symbol of societal order and the preservation of familial power. The social structure depended on these unions, and often, love took a back seat. The women, despite being used as tools for political alliances, sometimes found subtle ways to assert their influence, and some were able to navigate this strict system with agency. However, their sexuality and their marriages were never truly their own. They were forever intertwined with the greater political landscape. The men, too, had their part to play. For them, sexual relations were often viewed in terms of duty, securing heirs, expanding alliances, and ensuring the survival of their lineage. The notion of romantic love, while not absent, was often secondary to the obligations and expectations placed upon them. Fathers and sons, in particular, understood the importance of the bloodline and were taught that their marriages were a necessary tool to further the goals of their families. Yet, beneath this rigid framework, there were moments of human tenderness. After all, not every marriage was one of pure politics or arranged solely for the benefits of power. In some cases, especially among the nobility, mutual affection could develop between husband and wife. These bonds, however rare, were celebrated within the confines of the family. Still, they were the exception, not the rule. For most, marriage was a task that had to be carried out, whether there was affection involved or not. It's fascinating to think that, despite the strictness of these marriages, they still involved moments of intimacy and closeness. The medieval elite may not have enjoyed the same level of sexual freedom that we might expect today, but their relationships were far more complex than mere duty. The idea of sex within these unions was more than a physical act. It was a performance of power, and in many ways, an extension of the politics of the court. But it wasn't always so distant and detached. Historians still debate whether the medieval nobility ever experienced genuine emotional and sexual fulfillment in their marriages. Was it only the nobility's higher status that allowed them to occasionally escape the pressures of political marriage? Or did they suffer from the same constraints as everyone else? Some argue that there was more room for emotional connection than we might expect, while others suggest that the rigidity of their roles left little room for intimacy beyond procreation. Regardless, the private chambers, the shared meals, the whispered conversations, all of these were part of the delicate dance that made up the complex lives of the medieval elite. And in the grand scheme of things, this marriage dynamic, where politics, power, and passion intertwine, serves as the backdrop to the wider narrative of medieval sexuality, behind the heavy doors and guarded walls of noble households, you begin to understand that sexuality was never just about pleasure. It was about survival, power, and status. Even when it was just the flicker of a flame in the intimacy of the bedchamber, it was part of a much larger tapestry. A tapestry where the very concept of sex and intimacy shaped the course of history, culture, and societal evolution. As you stand in this world, watching the nuances of medieval marriages play out in the flickering candlelight, you can't help but be struck by the complexity of it all. Despite the rigid structures and societal constraints, there were moments of freedom, moments of human connection, and in those moments, one might imagine that love and lust found their way into the hearts of even the most powerful and controlled of medieval people. As you continue your journey through the medieval world, you find yourself in the midst of a bustling marketplace. The air is alive with the sounds of traders calling out their wares, the clinking of coins, and the occasional laughter of children running through the crowds. There's a sense of vibrancy here, as if the marketplace is the heart of the town, beating with the rhythm of commerce and social interaction. The earthy smell of fresh bread mixes with the pungent aroma of fish and meats, while the sweet scent of honey and fruits lingers in the air, tempting passers-by. The marketplace is where the flow of goods, gossip, and life converge. But it's not just the spices, textiles, or livestock that catch your attention. It's the people, men and women, young and old, all walking through this vibrant space with purpose. It's here that you see how medieval sexuality and marriage intersect with the broader social dynamics. Women, although often seen as secondary in terms of public power, are actively participating in the marketplace, selling goods, exchanging news, and, in many ways, asserting their roles within the community. They may not hold the same authority as their husbands or fathers, but they hold a power of their own, one that comes from their ability to control the flow of goods, ideas, and sometimes even wealth. As you look around, you can't help but notice the many young women who are adorned with modest yet striking dresses. Their hair is neatly braided or tucked into hoods, their faces painted with light touches of rouge. Though it's clear they're not trying to draw attention in the way modern fashion does, their beauty is subtle, framed by the careful simplicity of their clothing. But what's truly fascinating is that, despite the constraints placed on women in medieval society, there's a certain agency in their movements. They may not have had the luxury of choosing whom they married, but they certainly had a hand in the economic pulse of their communities. In a market like this, marriages aren't just about two people. They're about families, communities, and even trade. The arrangements may have been made by families with an eye toward alliances, but the individuals themselves often played a much larger role in how those alliances were maintained. And while a woman's position in marriage might have been dictated by her family's wealth or status, her ability to navigate the marketplace, negotiate prices, and interact with others allowed her to wield a type of power that was both subtle and crucial. You can imagine the quiet tensions at play as a woman considers an offer. The way her eyes meet those of a suitor across the crowded square, or how she silently exchanges knowing glances with her family. Perhaps there's an agreement to be made, or maybe a chance to assert her independence. Just a little. While the public arena may not offer the same freedoms for women as private spaces did for men, there's still room for influence. And in a marketplace like this, that power, though subtle, can't be ignored. But it's not just the women who occupy this space. Men are, of course, just as central to the scene. They are the ones making deals, shaking hands, and engaging in the rough-and-tumble world of medieval trade. But as much as they might dominate in the public space, their role in marriage and sexuality is similarly shaped by the expectations of society. The concept of masculinity, much like femininity, is not left up to the individual to define. In this world, a man's status and reputation are often dependent on his ability to provide for his family and maintain strong alliances. And these men, too, are influenced by the market's pulse. The wealth and goods they gather here help to determine their value as potential suitors. It's not simply about love or lust. It's about status, power, and wealth. The market is, in many ways, a reflection of the marriage market itself. A man's ability to accumulate wealth, to engage in trade, and to secure his family's interests is just as crucial as his physical presence within the home. As you walk through this vibrant, bustling scene, you begin to realize that marriage and sexuality in the medieval period were much more than private matters. They were deeply intertwined with the social and economic fabric of the time. Whether it was the market, the family, or the home, these spaces were where men and women alike found their roles, asserted their influence, and navigated the sometimes murky waters of desire, duty, and power. Historians still argue whether the medieval market, as a public space, gave women more agency in their relationships, or if it was simply another arena for them to navigate within the confines of societal expectations. Some believe that these spaces provided women with a chance to shape their own futures, while others suggest that the power dynamics were still heavily skewed in favor of men. Either way, it's clear that the market wasn't just a place for trade. It was a battleground where the dynamics of marriage, sexuality, and power played out in public view. As you observe this world, you can't help but wonder how much of this dynamic still exists today. How much of what we think of as private, our relationships, our desires, our choices, is still shaped by the larger societal forces that we cannot control. Just as the medieval marketplace played a central role in shaping the lives of those within it, our modern world continues to shape the dynamics of relationships in ways that are both subtle and undeniable. But for now, as you stand in this medieval marketplace, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of the world, you can't help but feel a sense of connection to these people. Their lives, though far removed from ours in time, are still shaped by the same basic human impulses: desire, power, and the need for connection. It's a timeless dance, one that continues to play out in every corner of the world. You now find yourself in a quiet corner of the medieval village, where the hustle and bustle of the marketplace has faded into a calm stillness. It's evening, and the warm glow of oil lamps flickers against the stone walls, casting long shadows across the dirt streets. The smell of burning wood and freshly baked bread fills the air, blending with the sharp scent of the cool night. Here, in the privacy of this humble home, life slows to a more intimate pace. Inside, the hearth crackles, its fire casting a soft glow on the faces of a family gathered around a simple wooden table. The scene is peaceful, but there's an underlying tension. The role of sexuality in the medieval period was largely centered around the home. Here, within these walls, the institution of marriage holds court. The man and woman sit side by side, their hands occasionally brushing as they reach for a shared loaf of bread or a bowl of soup. But it's not just about the food or the warmth of the fire. It's about the expectations and roles they play in the larger social structure. The man, perhaps the head of the household, carries the weight of providing for his family. His ability to provide for his wife and children speaks directly to his honor, his masculinity. A man's power in medieval society wasn't just derived from his public image or wealth. It was anchored in his ability to fulfill his duty at home, to be a strong provider and protector. His masculinity is tied to the protection and care of his family. And the idea of providing for his wife sexually is part of this duty. Sex in marriage was seen less as an act of passion and more as a vital component of family life, its purpose to procreate and to preserve the family lineage. Historians still argue whether sex within medieval marriage was ever truly about pleasure or if it was always more about duty and reproduction. Some scholars suggest that romantic love, as we understand it today, was a relatively late development, and that medieval people saw sex primarily through a functional, almost business-like lens. Others argue that while sex was certainly seen as a way to create heirs, there were also moments of genuine affection and perhaps even passion between husbands and wives. But as the couple shares their meal in this humble, quiet moment, their relationship, like many others in the medieval world, is shaped by these larger forces. There is little room for autonomy within their roles. And yet, the small intimacies shared between them hold a deep, unspoken connection. Perhaps the wife gently nudges her husband's arm, or he smiles at her in a way that reveals a tenderness between them. These small gestures, though subtle, offer a glimpse into the private side of medieval sexuality, one that is hidden behind the public facade of marriage and duty. In this quiet moment, the wife reflects on her role in the household. Her worth is tied to her ability to bear children, keep the home, and serve her husband. But her sexuality, too, is not entirely her own. Medieval women were often expected to perform their wifely duties without much room for personal pleasure or desire. A woman's role was centered around reproduction, and any notion of sex as something for personal pleasure was secondary, if not entirely absent. But that doesn't mean there wasn't space for affection and tenderness, though it may not have been celebrated in the same way we understand today. Despite this, the wife in this scene isn't passive. She plays an integral role in shaping the rhythm of life at home. She is the one who cares for the hearth, prepares the meals, and manages the household. She is the foundation on which the family rests. And within her marriage, her sexuality, too, plays an important part. It is not just about fulfilling her husband's needs. It is about maintaining the very structure of their life together, ensuring that their marriage remains productive, and that their future children will carry on the family name. As you watch this scene unfold, you realize that the medieval home was a place where sexuality, love, and duty intermingled in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. While the public world was one of rigid gender roles, the private world allowed for moments of intimacy that were not always governed by social expectations. This contrast between the public and private spheres, between the world of duty and the world of personal connection, offers a glimpse into the complicated ways in which sex, marriage, and gender were understood in the medieval period. The wife in this scene, though undoubtedly shaped by the constraints of her time, is not merely a passive participant in her marriage. She is a caretaker, a mother, and a woman whose role, while defined by societal expectations, also holds the possibility for subtle acts of defiance and tenderness in the quiet moments shared between the couple. There is an intimacy that transcends the boundaries of duty and expectation, a quiet rebellion against the rigid confines of medieval society. Historians still debate how much agency medieval women had in their marriages, particularly when it came to sex. Some argue that medieval women were largely confined to the roles of wife and mother, with little room for autonomy or desire. Others suggest that there were moments of sexual pleasure, affection, and even romance between medieval couples. Even if those moments were overshadowed by the demands of society and family life. Regardless of where one stands on this debate, it's clear that the world of medieval marriage and sexuality was complex, multifaceted, and deeply shaped by the forces of society, religion, and duty. As the sun sets behind the walls of the small stone cottage, you can hear the faint sounds of the village winding down for the evening. The daily rhythm of life in medieval times is simple, yet filled with meaning. The wife of the household is not alone in her role. There are other women in the village who carry similar duties, who too serve as the backbone of the family, but despite the closeness of their shared experiences, there is little room for personal relationships beyond the confines of their roles. Women's sexuality, even within the home, was often viewed as something that belonged to their husbands and to the larger societal framework of reproduction. In a world where the idea of sexual autonomy was foreign, the wife's body belonged to her husband, not only in terms of sexual activity, but also in how it related to family and societal duty. The thought of sex as a pleasurable, personal experience was almost non-existent in the medieval mindset. The emphasis was on procreation, ensuring the survival of the family line, and performing one's wifely duties. In this world, the idea of romantic love wasn't quite what we think of today. While affection between husband and wife certainly existed, it was often bound by the limits of responsibility and expectation. Love, if it could even be called that, was tied to the role each person played in the marriage. The wife's love was expressed in nurturing the home, caring for the children, and fulfilling her duty to her husband, who was the head of the household. But even within the domestic realm, there was little space for independent desire. There were, however, moments of shared tenderness that broke through these societal roles. The village, tucked away in the heart of medieval life, wasn't just a place of work. It was a place where daily life and religion intertwined. Every aspect of life, be it eating, working, or even sex, was seen through the lens of religious belief. Church and state played a heavy role in regulating morality, including sexual conduct. The notion of purity, often linked to virginity or marital fidelity, held a weighty influence over how sex was viewed within the medieval marriage. Imagine the wife as she moves to the bed, feeling the heavy weight of both her responsibilities and her role within the marriage. She knows that sex is expected of her, not just to fulfill her husband's needs, but to fulfill the purpose of continuing the family line. It's not about pleasure or personal connection. It's about duty. The light of the candles flickers on the walls, casting long shadows as she settles next to her husband. Their shared history together is there, between them, unspoken but understood. It's a bond forged not through romantic affection, but through the shared labor of life and the importance of continuing the family. The husband, too, understands his role. He knows that his masculinity and reputation are tied to his ability to perform his duties in marriage, both as a provider and as a man who can ensure the survival of his family. His relationship with his wife, though built on an often unspoken understanding of duty, is not devoid of tenderness. The touch of his hand, perhaps as he brushes her arm in the quiet of the night, speaks of a subtle affection. And yet, even in these small moments, their relationship is defined by the roles they play, the social expectations they uphold. Sex, for these medieval couples, is often an act done in the dark corners of their lives. It is not something celebrated, but it is certainly something necessary. As the wife lies beside her husband, she feels a moment of quiet realization. This is her world, and in this world, her sexuality is defined by the roles she plays, by the expectations of her family, her husband, and society. There's little room for personal desire, and even less room for romantic notions as we understand them today. Historians still argue whether medieval marriage was primarily a contractual arrangement based on societal and familial duty, or whether it could also encompass moments of genuine affection and connection. Some scholars suggest that medieval marriages were largely utilitarian, focused on the exchange of goods, property, and ensuring the continuation of the family. Others believe that despite the restrictions placed on medieval sexuality, there were moments of emotional and physical intimacy between husbands and wives, even if those moments were overshadowed by the overarching cultural norms. In the quiet of the bedroom, the wife contemplates her role, and her thoughts turn toward the future. Will she have children? How many will she bear? These questions are not just about family, though they are certainly about family, but also about the preservation of the family name, the continuation of the lineage. These questions are shaped by the medieval world, a world in which personal desire and romantic love are secondary to the demands of society and the church. But even within these constraints, the intimacy between husband and wife carries a subtle tenderness, a connection that transcends the roles they are expected to play. The passing days in the medieval village follow a predictable rhythm, defined by the change of seasons, the harvest, and the cycle of life. Yet, despite the rigid expectations placed on marriage and sexuality, there are moments when the human experience, the need for connection, and the desire for intimacy surface in unexpected ways. It is during these moments, often hidden away from the gaze of society, that the complexities of human sexuality can be found. In medieval society, sexual norms were shaped by religion and law. But in the quiet corners of life, a different story unfolds. The concept of virginity, particularly for women, was paramount in medieval times. It was not only a sign of purity, but also a symbol of familial and social honor. The importance of virginity was so deeply ingrained that a woman's worth was often tied to it. This pressure made the night of the wedding particularly fraught, as it was expected that a woman's virginity be preserved until the marriage bed. But what happens when the expectations of this night, the culmination of months, or even years, of preparation, are disrupted? The tension in the marriage bed is palpable. For many women, the night of their wedding was not one of desire or excitement, but one of anxiety. They had been taught that their role was to serve their husband, and that their body was not truly theirs to command. In some cases, it was the woman's first time experiencing sexual intercourse, which could be physically painful. The emotions surrounding this first encounter were often complex: fear, trepidation, curiosity, and sometimes a deep sense of resignation. In many ways, the wedding night was not about the joy of sexual union, but about fulfilling a societal and marital obligation. The first night of marriage was crucial not only for the couple, but for the community as well. The act of consummation was seen as a confirmation of the marriage and the couple's ability to produce offspring. In some cultures, the consummation of marriage was even celebrated, with the community looking on with anticipation. However, this public acknowledgement of the couple's sexual union was often tempered by the harsh societal rules governing sexuality. The woman was expected to be passive, to surrender herself to her husband's desires without question. In a world where the church wielded significant power, sexuality was also seen as a divine responsibility. The religious teachings of the time were clear. Sex within marriage was a necessary act, but it was a means to an end: procreation. The belief that the act of sex was for reproduction only was pervasive, and pleasure, especially for women, was often dismissed as secondary or even sinful. Any enjoyment a woman might have derived from the act was seen as a threat to the moral order of society. In the eyes of the church, a woman's pleasure in sex could be seen as a sin, as it would distract from the holy purpose of marriage, the creation of children. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval couples actually experienced sexual pleasure. Some argue that the focus on reproduction left little room for intimacy or enjoyment in the marital bed, while others believe that the medieval world was not as sexually repressed as we might imagine. There is evidence, in the form of medical texts, literature, and art, that suggests that the desire for sexual intimacy was alive and well, even if it was not always acknowledged in public. The wife, though often portrayed as passive and subservient, was still a woman with needs and desires, and in some cases, she found ways to navigate the limitations of her role. As you lay beside your husband in the quiet of the night, you feel the weight of your role settle upon you. It's not just about fulfilling your duty. It's about survival. In a society where the family unit was the cornerstone of existence, the act of reproduction was the key to preserving your legacy, your family, and your place in the world. And yet, even within this rigid structure, there were moments when human connection, tenderness, and intimacy shone through, like small sparks in the dark. Despite the rules, despite the roles, the essence of human sexuality found a way to emerge. The wife's body, though bound by the strict expectations of society, is still her own. It may not belong to her in the same way that modern women experience autonomy, but in the private moments of the marriage bed, she can begin to understand her body's own responses, its own desires. As much as the world around her tells her to submit, there is a quiet rebellion in these small acts of intimacy. Tiny gestures that reveal a deeper connection between husband and wife. These moments, though subtle, are the threads that weave the fabric of their marriage. In the larger context of medieval life, sexuality was not just a private affair, it was an affair of state, of the church, and of family. The couple's ability to produce heirs was a matter of public record. The fruits of the marriage bed were not just about personal fulfillment. They were about ensuring the survival of the family name, the family line, and the greater social order. In the eyes of society, the act of sex was a transaction, one that transcended personal desire and instead focused on societal needs. But even in this transactional world, the wife's body was not devoid of agency. Historians still debate whether medieval women found ways to express their sexual desires and pleasures outside the confines of their marital roles. Some argue that the strictures of society and the church left little room for women to enjoy sex in the way modern people might think of it. Others suggest that medieval couples were more intimate than we give them credit for, finding ways to carve out moments of connection despite the oppressive structures surrounding them. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: the marriage bed, with all its rules and rituals, was also a space where intimacy, connection, and desire could quietly flourish. As you feel the warmth of your husband's body next to yours, you realize that this moment, though constrained by the expectations of your time, is still a part of your story. It is not simply a duty, it is a part of the human experience, filled with its own small pleasures, its own quiet joys. In this moment, despite the weight of the world around you, you are not just a wife, you are a woman who is part of something much larger than herself. As the days pass in the medieval household, the rhythm of life moves steadily forward, guided by the natural order of things, the hum of daily chores, the singing of birds at dawn, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees become the soundtrack to the lives of those who inhabit this world. Yet, within the confines of this simple, structured existence, there is still a world of untold stories. The life of a medieval wife, the quiet yet powerful force that holds together the household, is full of unspoken layers, emotions, and experiences that would shape the future in ways no one could predict. You are, in many ways, the backbone of your household. Your days are filled with work, from gathering water to tending the hearth, from preparing food to caring for your children. Yet, even in the midst of these tasks, the question of your worth, the very purpose of your existence, looms over you. In a society where women's lives are defined by their roles as wives and mothers, there is little room for anything beyond these expectations. You are here to support, to nurture, to be the quiet strength that holds everything together. But beneath that surface, there is a part of you that longs for something more, something that cannot be easily named or defined. The medieval marriage, though often thought of as a practical arrangement, also holds moments of tenderness, companionship, and, surprisingly, affection. While the primary function of marriage was, of course, procreation, it did not always exist in a vacuum of duty. There were moments when love, however fleeting, could be found amidst the hardships and the expectations. The marriage bed, though subject to the rules of reproduction, was not just a space for obligation. It was also a space where intimacy, connection, and even tenderness could exist between husband and wife. Historians still argue whether the medieval marriage was entirely devoid of romantic love, or if such love existed, but was simply expressed differently than we understand it today. Some suggest that romantic love, as we know it, was a later invention of the Renaissance, while others believe that love and affection were indeed a part of medieval marriages, though not in the way modern society might expect. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that the emotional bonds between husband and wife were more complex than the rigid structures of the time would suggest. You often find yourself in moments of quiet reflection, thinking about the meaning of it all. How much of your life is defined by what others expect of you? How much of it is shaped by the unspoken bonds you share with your husband, with your children, with your community? There is behind him at times a yearning for something more, something deeper, that cannot be found in the daily grind of survival. The hours you spend in silence, working, caring for the family, feel both fleeting and eternal. The weight of your role, of your duties, often makes you feel as though you are suspended in time, unable to escape or change. Yet, as you tend to the hearth, as you prepare meals for your family, as you care for your children and watch them grow, you begin to realize something. The work you do, the life you lead, is important. It is not a life lived for yourself, but for the future, for the family, for the generations that will follow. You may not have much agency in the grand scheme of things, but the work you do is the foundation upon which everything else stands. Your role is central to the survival and flourishing of your household. And in that, you find a quiet sense of pride. You may not be able to change the world, but you can shape the lives of those around you. The days pass with a sense of quiet purpose. There is no room for distractions, no space for rebellion. The expectations of society, the church, and the family weigh heavily on you. Yet, despite the constraints, there is a small spark of something else. A quiet defiance, perhaps, or a recognition of the subtle power you hold in your own right. You may not be able to voice your desires, but there are moments when you can feel them stir within you. When the sense of who you are becomes more than just a wife and mother, more than just a caretaker. You are a woman, with thoughts, feelings, and desires of your own. And perhaps, just perhaps, there is more to life than this. Historians still debate the nature of women's roles in medieval society. Some argue that women were completely subjugated, their lives defined solely by their relationships to their fathers, husbands, and children. Others suggest that medieval women, despite the constraints of their roles, found ways to express their agency and desires, whether in the private sphere of their homes or in subtle forms of resistance against the systems that sought to control them. The truth, as with most things, likely lies somewhere in between. The medieval wife was both bound by the expectations of society and capable of quietly carving out her own space within those boundaries. As you stand in the quiet of your home, with the flickering light of the hearth casting long shadows on the walls, you realize that you are a part of something much larger than yourself. The life you lead, though simple and often harsh, is one that contributes to the survival and continuity of your family, your community, and your society. You may not be able to change the world, but you can shape the lives of those around you, and in that, there is power. In this quiet world, where the mundane tasks of daily life are punctuated by moments of introspection, the sense of time feels oddly suspended. The work you do is constant, yet each day seems to blur into the next, like the river's flow that never truly stops, but simply continues forward. You are part of an intricate web of life, one that stretches beyond your household and ties you to the larger rhythm of the medieval world. Your family's well-being depends on the seasons, the harvests, and the strength of your community. The larger world, outside your immediate space, is still just as unpredictable as it has always been. But there's something reassuring in knowing that your role, no matter how small, contributes to the steady pulse of this existence. Yet, while your role is vital, it is also invisible. You are a shadow behind the scenes, always working but rarely noticed. As a medieval woman, your life is defined by the cycles of nature and the cycles of your family's needs. But these cycles are not without their challenges. The weather, the unpredictability of the harvests, and the constant struggle to keep food in your home make each day feel like a delicate balancing act. It's a life where survival is never guaranteed. But somehow, you persist. There is strength in that persistence, a quiet resilience that becomes more pronounced as the years go by. And as the seasons shift, so too do the rhythms of life. In the winter, when the cold winds blow and the fields lay fallow, there is a sense of stillness that pervades your household. The hearth becomes the heart of the home, where warmth and light are most needed. In these months, there is less to do, and the work slows. You take the time to mend clothes, to prepare for the next season's planting, and perhaps, just perhaps, to reflect on the year that has passed. The cold nights bring their own sort of quiet introspection as the world outside sleeps, and you are left alone with your thoughts. In spring, the world seems to awaken with a new sense of possibility. The first stirrings of life are felt in the soil, as you and your family begin to plant the seeds that will sustain you for the coming months. There is something magical about the renewal of the land. A reminder that, no matter how harsh the winter, life always finds a way to return. You watch as the crops begin to sprout, the shoots of barley and wheat pushing their way through the earth, reaching toward the sky. The air is thick with the smell of fresh earth, and you can almost feel the promise of abundance on the horizon. But spring also brings with it its own challenges. The unpredictable rains, the occasional frost, and the constant demands of planting and tending the crops can be overwhelming. The seasons seem to conspire against you at times, throwing one obstacle after another in your path. Yet, despite these challenges, you press on. Your resilience and determination, the driving forces that keep you going. Every day spent in the fields is a reminder of the fragility of life, but also of the power you hold in your hands. You are a part of a long line of women who have tended the earth, who have made sacrifices for the survival of their families and their communities. Historians still debate the role of women in agriculture during medieval times. Some argue that women's contributions were largely invisible, overshadowed by the male-dominated world of politics, warfare, and religion. Others suggest that women, particularly in rural communities, played a far more central role in food production than is often acknowledged. Women were the ones who managed the household gardens, who planted and harvested the crops, and who were responsible for much of the food preparation. The idea that women were simply helpers in these agricultural endeavors is now being questioned, with a growing recognition of their crucial role in ensuring the survival of medieval communities. As summer approaches, the hard work of planting begins to bear fruit. The fields are lush with crops, and the air is thick with the scent of ripening grain. It's a time of abundance, a time when the harvests are near, and the work that was done in the early spring begins to pay off. The long wetchimsa, hot days of summer are filled with labor, but there is a sense of satisfaction that comes with the promise of a good harvest. You work alongside your family, side by side, under the blistering sun, collecting the fruits of your labor. But even in the midst of abundance, there is always the looming uncertainty of the future. The weather could change in an instant, the crops could fail, and the very survival of your family could be threatened. This constant tension between abundance and scarcity is something that you live with every day. It's a reminder that no matter how much you plan, the future is always uncertain. In the fall, when the harvest is complete, there is a sense of relief that washes over you. The hard work of the past months is done, And now it's time to prepare for the winter months ahead. The grains are stored, the animals are tended to, and the work slows once again. It's a time to reflect, to rest, and to be thankful for the bounty that you've worked so hard to create. But even as you rest, you know that the cycle will begin again soon. The winter months will pass, and you will once again plant the seeds that will sustain your family for the next year. Historians still debate the significance of seasonal cycles in medieval society. Some suggest that the rhythm of the seasons shaped every aspect of life, from the food people ate to the festivals they celebrated. Others argue that the cycles of nature were seen primarily as a means of survival, with little room for deeper meaning or spiritual reflection. What is clear, however, is that the changing seasons had a profound impact on the lives of medieval people. They shaped their work, their celebrations, and their connection to the land. And for you, the cycle of seasons represents a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the strength it takes to survive. As the days grow shorter and the nights longer, you look back on the year with a sense of quiet pride. The land has provided for you, and you have worked hard to ensure the survival of your family. You may not have been able to change the world, but you have shaped the lives of those around you. Your labor, your love, and your resilience have created something enduring, something that will live on long after you. The years pass by in a steady rhythm, like the seasons themselves. The routines of your life become more ingrained with every passing cycle. It's a dance of survival and perseverance. Each year, you plant, you harvest, and you prepare for what the future holds. Your days are long, filled with work that may never be fully acknowledged by anyone outside your family, but which is essential nonetheless. You begin to recognize the seasons as more than just the weather. They are the heartbeat of your world, and you are intimately connected to that pulse. In the midst of all this, you can't help but wonder about the world beyond your own land, beyond the boundaries of your small, rural community. The horizon is distant, and the unknown is vast. But you're not entirely unfamiliar with it. There are whispers, stories of travelers, of merchants, and sometimes of soldiers, people who venture into lands unknown to your village. These stories are shared in hushed tones as you sit around the fire at night, your hands busy with the chores of the evening, your mind half engaged with the comforting routine of your daily tasks. You might imagine the world that exists beyond, where kings sit on their thrones, where armies march, and where the gods are invoked in grand temples built from stone. It seems so far removed from the life you lead. You work the land. You live in a house of wood and thatch, bound by the unyielding seasons of the earth. You have no palace, no grand temple, but your life, as small as it seems, is still part of the same grand tapestry that stretches across the ancient world. But even as you wonder about this distant world, your connection to the earth and the cycles of nature pulls you back to your own life. The winds of change are always blowing, but they are difficult to perceive when your feet are firmly planted in the soil. You have heard that some of the greatest cities are built upon the backs of hard-working people like you. People whose lives are intertwined with the earth and who have learned to bend the land to their will. But these cities, these wonders of the world, are still something distant, like the farthest reaches of your imagination. You know that the seasons are the true measure of time here. The warm months of spring and summer bring life, growth, and work. The cold months of fall and winter bring rest, reflection, and quiet endurance. And within this cycle, you play your role. The land is unforgiving, yet it rewards you with the fruits of your labor. You have seen crops fail, and you have seen them thrive. The earth is fickle, but it is always there. And you, in turn, are always there for it, tending to it, nurturing it, working with it in a silent, unspoken pact. But perhaps, after all, there is something more to it. Maybe, in the grander scheme of things, your small plot of land is no less important than those distant cities. After all, it is the labor of people like you, those who work the land, that sustains the great civilizations. Without the earth's bounty, no kings could rule, no armies could march, and no great cities could rise. Your hands, your sweat, and your efforts have a quiet power that shapes the course of history, even if that history is never written down in the annals of kings or emperors. The arrival of the harvest season brings with it a deep sense of accomplishment. The hard work of planting, of caring for the crops, and of battling the elements all comes to fruition in this moment. The grains are harvested, the livestock are tended, and the food is stored for the winter. Your family, your community, all share in this bounty. It is a time of celebration, a time to gather around the hearth and share the fruits of your labor. The work is far from over, but for a moment, there is peace. Historians often romanticize the idea of the harvest, portraying it as a time of joyous festivity and plenty. And in truth, there is much to be thankful for. The abundance of the earth, the sustenance that feeds your family, and the sense of accomplishment that comes with seeing the results of your hard work. Yet, for all the joy that comes with the harvest, there is also a quiet acknowledgement of the fragility of life. The harvest, like the seasons, is fleeting. The abundance you have now may not be guaranteed in the future. The land is generous, but it is also demanding, and it requires constant care and respect. As the harvest comes to an end and the colder months settle in, you take a moment to reflect on all that you have accomplished and all that is yet to come. The work is never done. The cycle will begin again. But in this quiet moment, surrounded by the fruits of your labor, there is a deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that you are part of something much larger than yourself. The seasons will continue to turn, the earth will continue to give, and you will continue to labor, just as your ancestors did, and just as your descendants will. Historians still debate the nature of ancient labor. Some suggest that the toil of early agricultural societies was seen as a form of hardship, a struggle against the forces of nature. Others argue that, despite the hardships, these societies found a deep sense of fulfillment in their work, a sense of purpose that transcended the labor itself. What is clear, however, is that labor was the cornerstone of ancient life. It was through the labor of people like you, people who worked the land, that early civilizations were able to thrive. And as you sit by the hearth, the warm fire crackling in the background, you realize that your life is not as small as it sometimes feels. You are part of the great cycle of nature, a cycle that has been repeating for thousands of years and will continue to do so long after you are gone. Your labor, your care for the land, your connection to the earth, all contribute to the ongoing story of humanity. The days grow shorter as the seasons continue their inevitable march. The warmth of summer begins to fade, replaced by the crispness of autumn's chill. The wind whispers through the trees, a reminder of the passage of time, and with it, A quiet sense of reflection begins to settle over you. The harvest has been gathered, the work of the fields has come to an end, and the fruits of your labor have been stored for the colder months ahead. You feel a sense of accomplishment, but also a quiet anticipation for what the future holds. In this quiet season, you find yourself more attuned to the rhythms of the earth. The days are still long enough to allow for moments of rest, yet there is always something to be done. The animals need tending, the tools must be maintained, and the fires must be kept stoked. The work is never truly done. But in the stillness of the night, as you sit by the hearth, there is a deep sense of peace that washes over you. The world outside may be harsh and unpredictable, but here, in this small corner of the world, there is a sense of security, of home. Historians often romanticize the idea of life in ancient times, portraying it as a simpler, more peaceful existence. And in many ways, this is true. The daily rhythms of life were dictated by the natural world, and people were intimately connected to the land in a way that is difficult for us to understand today. But for all the beauty and the simplicity of that existence, there was also hardship. The earth was unforgiving, and survival was always a delicate balance. The cycles of life and death were inextricably linked to the cycles of nature. And yet, despite the hardships, there was a quiet sense of satisfaction in knowing that your work, your care for the land, was vital to the survival of your community. As you sit by the fire, your thoughts drift back to the beginning, to those first steps into this world. The land that once felt foreign, that once felt intimidating and wild, has become familiar. You have learned its ways, understood its patterns, and have become a part of it. The soil beneath your feet, the crops that you tend, the animals that you care for. These are not just the building blocks of survival. They are the foundation of life itself. In the distance, you hear the faint sound of children playing, their laughter carrying through the cold air. It is a sound that reminds you of the future, of those who will come after you, and of the legacy that you will leave behind. The work you do now will shape their world, just as the work of your ancestors has shaped yours. The cycle of life continues, and with it, the continuity of civilization. Your hands, your labor, and your care for the land will ensure that the future will be built upon the foundation of what you have created. Historians still debate the nature of ancient agricultural societies. Some argue that these early civilizations were marked by a strong sense of community, where everyone worked together for the common good. Others suggest that these societies were more fragmented, with different groups competing for resources and power. What is clear, however, is that agriculture was the key to the development of civilization. Without the ability to produce food consistently, no society could have survived for long. The labor of individuals, like you, was the foundation of that survival. And as you watch the embers glow in the fire, you realize that the work you've done, the labor you've put into the land, is not just for survival. It is for something greater, a legacy that will endure long after you are gone. You are part of a chain of generations, a link in the endless cycle of life, death, and renewal. Your work will be passed down, just as it has been passed down through the ages, and your descendants will continue to build upon the foundation that you have laid. So as the night settles in, the warmth of the fire enveloping you, you close your eyes and let the quiet of the moment wash over you. The world may be vast, and the future uncertain. But for now, you are content. The land is your home, the seasons are your guide, and your work is your legacy. You are part of something greater than yourself, and that knowledge brings a sense of peace and fulfillment that nothing else can. As the fire burns low and the darkness deepens, you drift off to sleep, knowing that tomorrow the work will begin anew. The cycle of life will continue, as it always has, and you will be there to meet it, ready to shape the future, one day at a time.